our lesson number 6 on Gideon. If you remember from last week, you can leave it right there for now, Chad. If you remember from last week, we saw our next judge that God raised up to help deliver the Israelites from their not faithfulness or unfaithfulness to God. And it, of course, was Gideon. And we saw initially the first beginnings of what Gideon kind of is, who he is, where he came from. And mainly what we spent last week talking about was the magnitude of Gideon's doubt. And there was a whole bunch of it. He had plenty of excuses. He had plenty of reasons why he did not need to be called to do what God was calling him to do. He had all the reasons, and he wanted all the different scenarios played out in front of him so that he could be sure that God was with him and that God would give him eventual victory and all these different things. We're going to continue to see that same type of thing today with Gideon as we start in verse number 25. Gideon wanted God to bring out and have this meal prepared for him, and the angel of the Lord burnt this meal up to show the power of God. And to continue to reveal that his faith and his respect for God was really, really weak, and God's going to continue to work on that, right? Instead of just kind of kicking Gideon to the side, realizing that he's a pretty weak man, God just continues to be faithful to his promise to Gideon, continues to give Gideon peace, continues to tell him, assures him he's not going to die. And as we eventually saw last week, Gideon beginning to feel some of the peace of God. So much to the point, as we saw in verse 24, that he, of course, erects this altar, Jehovah Shalom, the Lord is peace, and starting to see that God, right, not the gods, little g, of the Amorites, were actually the answer to the freedom from the oppression. The Israelites were in the position that they were because they had been praying to Baal and Ashtaroth, and they thought that they weren't doing enough, or whatever the case may have been, and that was why they were having all these different problems. When in reality, of course, we know it was the fact that Israel had sinned against God once again and had turned to false gods that was causing the problems. All right, that brings us to verse number 25. Go ahead there, Chad. Bring us to the third bullet point. Going there, perfect. And it brings us to verse 25, and we see some continued fears here of Gideon. In this case, his fellow people, right, the fellow countrymen that he is going to have to deal with. So let's jump into verse 25 down through verse 27, and we'll begin to see some more of scared Gideon here. Verse 25, and it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, Take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years old, and throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that is by it, and build an altar unto the Lord that God upon the top of this rock in the ordered place. And take the second bullock and offer burnt sacrifice with the wood of the grove which thou shalt cut down. Then Gideon took 10 men of his servants, and did as the Lord had said unto him. And so it was because he feared his father's household and the men of the city, that he could not do it by day, that he did it by night. All right, so now that God has revealed himself to Gideon once again, right, and Gideon has started to feel the effects of the peace of God and understand that he was, in Gideon's eyes, at least somewhat in control of the situation. God gives Gideon some instructions, okay? In the first instructions that he gives Gideon is to do what? Go to his dad's house and do what? Destroy the false god altar. Get rid of it completely. Okay, so what this allows us to see is a little bit of insight into Gideon's life, right? What he was living with. His dad was obviously doing the same thing that the other children of Israel were doing in worshiping Baal, and not just going to like the temples to do this, right? His dad was obviously well versed and deeply into this false god worshiping, so much to the point that there was an altar to Baal in the house, okay? Which intimate setting, right? You got something in your house you think is very important. You keep things that are of great importance in your house. So we can kind of see just how in line Gideon's fathers was living with this ungodly secular paganistic lifestyle of worshiping this false god. So much he'd brought an altar into the house. Okay? I liken this to having the family Bible on the coffee table, right? And this is how intimate this is, that this is going on. And God gives him explicit instructions to go in and destroy that altar, and then build an altar to God in its place, right? And offer up sacrifices. Now, frame of reference here. An altar to Baal, measuring 26 feet across, has been found in that part of Israel. Okay, so 26 feet across. Think of how wide that is. That's a big area. So an altar measuring 26 feet across has been found in that part of Israel. Gideon burned that altar, probably very similar in size to 26 feet across, with the help of 10 men. Okay, he used a carved wood pole to feed the fire, and the pole was a grove representing the goddess of Ashtoreth. All right, so Gideon's men worked at night because they feared Gideon's household, and the townsmen, the idolatrous townsmen, would eventually attack them. Okay? So, verse 27, right? Then Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had said unto him. And so it was because of his fear his father's household and the men of the city that they did it by day and not by night. So you can kind of see how this was a project. This was an undertaking. This took some work to get done, and of course the fear of them being killed by the other people and the countrymen as well. What does the fear here that we see of Gideon, what does that reveal about his fear of God by electing to destroy the altar of Baal under the cover of darkness? What does it show about his fear of God and respect of God? We'll use that. That's probably a better word. Is Gideon doing what God asked? Yes, he is, right? So we're seeing from the initial part of Gideon, right? When the angel of the Lord first showed up, Gideon was like, I don't want nothing to do with this. We are seeing that Gideon is doing what God has asked him to do. So we're showing a building of faith here. But is Gideon still reserved? Absolutely, right? Because he is doing this in the cover of darkness. He isn't just busting in there and blowing this thing up as soon as he gets the chance because he's not worried about what may happen. God tells him to destroy the altar. God's obviously going to take care of him while he is destroying the altar. So while we're seeing a building of faith here of Gideon, we are still, it's growing, but it's not quite at full strength yet, right? It's in a process of maturing. He didn't fear God enough yet to trust him with his life. He's doing what is asked, but he doesn't fully trust him quite yet. Gideon's crew here works through the night. The second bull was still burning on the altar to God when the town emerged to find that the altar to Baal has been destroyed. Okay, verse 28 here. And Gideon, and when the men of the city arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was cast down, and the grove was cut down that was by it, and the second bullock was offered upon the altar that was built. And they said one to another, Who hath done this thing? And when they inquired and asked, they said, Gideon the son of Joash hath done this thing. And the men of the city said unto Joash, Bring out thy son that he may die, because he hath cast down the altar of Baal, and because he hath cut down the grove that was by it. So early into the morning, this sacrifice is still burning. The people are waking up like normal, go to work, or make their sacrifices, or whatever they do when they first wake up in the morning, and they find that this altar is gone, right? It's completely destroyed. The grove that is around has been cut down as well. And they want to know who did this atrocious act, right? This is great monstrosity of an act that has taken place. It's a terrible, terrible thing. They want to know who did it so they can find the person or people and kill them. And we see that they find out, of course, and know that Gideon has done this. And Gideon has done what? at this point. He's made himself pretty scarce, right? Gideon's off somewhere else. He's either hiding somewhere. He's not standing by the altar that's burning the offering to God. He's made himself pretty scarce. But eventually, all fingers point right to him, and the townspeople call for Gideon's what? Verse 30 there. They want to do what? Or verse 28, 29. They want to kill him, right? They want his head. So let's just take a second and think about this, all right? Gideon has destroyed an altar to a false god, has built an altar to the one true God, is offering up a sacrifice to that one true God amongst God's chosen people, right? The Israelites are God's chosen people, and they are fully aware of what has taken place. They know, they understand that Gideon has destroyed this altar to Baal and has put up this altar to God, but they are so aligned with this false worship, this false God worship, that they think this great atrocity deserves Gideon to be put to death. Gideon's just trying to get these people pointed back to the one true God. They have fallen so far. They've become so convoluted in their outlook. They have become so in tune with this pagan lifestyle, which is counter to what God wants them to do. They want the man of God killed because of him destroying the false altar that was there. All right? So that shows you how far a decline the Israelites have come, how far they have fallen here. Joash, Gideon's father, eventually steps in and surprisingly persuades them to forego the killing of Gideon. Now, even though Joash sponsored the worship of Baal for the village, he abandoned Baal, and it's likely Gideon told his father about the appearance of the angel. So Joash comes to his son's defense here, becomes the Gideon defender, saying that Baal could defend himself if he truly were God. Let's keep reading here and go down to verse number 30 or 31. Let's go to verse 30 first. Then the men of the city said to Joash, "Bring out thy son that he may die, because he cast down the altar of Baal, because he's cut down the grove that was by it." And Joash said unto all that stood against him, okay, "Will ye plead for Baal? Will ye save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death, whilst it is yet morning. If he be a god, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar." Therefore on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, "Let Baal plead against him, because he hath thrown down his altar." So Joash, thankfully, right, comes to the defense here of his son and says, "Well, if Baal's truly a god, then let him kind of come in and take care of Gideon himself, or let him show his strength against what Gideon put up himself. It doesn't need you all. If he truly is a god, he doesn't need you all to defend him. He should be able to come in and defend himself, and that's the case. If Baal can come down and defend himself, well, then let him kill Gideon, right? Let him come in and take care of this atrocious act that has taken." So we see eventually Gideon is called Jerubbaal here, meaning let Baal plead, for he had contended with Baal and had won, right? Because Baal obviously is going to do nothing about the fact that Gideon took down his altar. Gideon was now ready to face another enemy, the Midianites. The sin at home had been addressed, and victory now on the battlefield is going to follow. So this whole event of Gideon going in, destroying this altar, and placing an altar of God there, it shows again a continued growth in Gideon's faith, but it also kind of takes care of the sin that was in his house, right? Because if the house is worshiping Baal, then obviously God is not going to be faithful, can't be faithful to taking care of the problems here, because they're not worshiping him. Now that the altar is there, that has been addressed. Gideon's father, who is kind of the ringleader of this, is also now denounced Baal and saying he can do it, defend for himself, allows the altar to remain, allows the sacrifice to remain, so the sin has been addressed, and now victory can kind of follow. against the enemy, the actual, the physical enemy that's in front of them, the Midianites, who have been oppressing them now for several years. Go ahead, Chad. All right, so we see now Gideon still, even in the midst of all these things, Gideon is still having some reserves and still has some fear, right? Gideon's a scared little man, and we're seeing that change some, but it's still, even though reputation is kind of beginning to precede itself, Gideon still has some reserves and some fears before he takes on the Midianite army. Down to verse number 33. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the children of the east were gathered together and went over and pitched in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and the Abiezer was gathered after him. Okay, so Gideon now has gained his reputation, not just as an opponent to the Midianites, but in turn an opponent to the false god Baal, right? When he tore down the altar and built up an altar of God, the line was drawn, right? The line was drawn there. So his reputation as being an opponent to Baal is there. They know that, right? And this is just as the annual invasion of the Midianites began, right? We know how the Midianites work. They're a nomadic people, but they would come into the Israelites at about what time? When would they come rolling around? Right at the harvest, right? Right about the harvest time, when they were starting to gather stuff for the summer, they would come in and either take what they wanted or destroy, right? One of the two things. They were making sure that the Israelites didn't have, right? That's essentially what they were doing. So this has obviously been going on now for several years. The Midianites usually came in during this time over in the valley of Jezreel, and would come in and start to destroy the flocks, destroy the calves that had been made, or that the cattle had, and so on and so forth. They would get rid of the harvest, take what they wanted, destroy the rest of it, anything to keep the Israelites oppressed. So this was kind of at this time frame here, all right? This encouraged other Israelites to follow him because of what he had done in his own house, right? He destroyed the altar of Baal, and this was Gideon was now gaining some momentum and some support amongst other Israelites as well. And the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Gideon here, as we're going to see, and he has a call to arms to bring an army to fight the Midianites, and we see how many people exactly showed up. Go to verse 34. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and Abiezer was gathered after him. And so he sent a messenger throughout all of Manasseh, who also was gathered after him. And he sent a messenger unto Asher, and unto Zebulun, and unto Naphtali, and they came up to meet him. And Gideon said unto God, If thou wilt save Israel by mine hand, as thou hast said, behold, I'll put a fleece on the floor, and it will be due by fleece and dry on the earth. And we'll get to that here in just a second. 32,000 troops is what, if you look over at chapter 7 and go to verse number 3. Now therefore go to proclaim the years of the people, saying, Whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return to depart early. And he returned of the people 22,000, there remained 10,000. Right? So he had 32,000 troops respond here to Gideon's first call to arms to help fight the Midianites. And as Judges chapter 6 here begins to close, as we'll see here in a second, we still see, even though Gideon now has these troops, even though God has done some pretty miraculous things in Gideon's life, even though he's destroyed this altar and his father's kind of stepped out, all these kind of somewhat supernatural things are happening, Gideon still has quite a bit of reserves and quite a bit of fear. And as chapter 6 closes, as we'll see here in just a second, we see another episode of the fear of Gideon. So maybe after the initial thrill of having 32,000 men show up to help him, he kind of takes a second to assess the strength of his army. compared to the Midianite army, and realizes that I don't have enough people. 135,000 Midianites is about what that army had, which would have been, they would have outnumbered the Israelites 4-1, 3-1, 4-1. And the Midianites, far more experienced, right? They're coming in every year to do this. They're warring with other people. The Israelites, we know, they're not much for warriors, right? We've seen this at this point in their history. Most of the time, don't even have any swords or anything. All this stuff's been taken from them. So they're not well versed in the art of war. And Gideon is probably realizing this, assessing this, and thinking, this is not going to work out like God says that it's going to work out. Israel's weapons have been confiscated. Little wonder here to see just exactly how afraid Gideon is, right? So that brings us to verse 36 here of chapter 6, and we see another episode of fear kind of taking over here with Gideon, okay? And Gideon says unto God, if thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool in the floor. And if the dew be on the fleece only, and be dry upon all the earth beside, then shall I know that thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said. And so, it was so, for he rose up early on the morrow, and thrust the fleece together, and wringed the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. Okay? So, Gideon says, of course, we know this story very, very well. I should have had Pip come up and give her description of it. It's pretty funny how she describes how this happens. She likes the story of Gideon. So he tells God, all right, I got a test for you. Okay? I'm going to put some wool outside. And when the dew comes in the morning, like it always does, I want the ground to be completely dry. But the wool needs to be wet, okay? Now, if you just think about this for a second, right, especially this time of year, if you leave a pair of boots or a pair of gloves out, right, you've been working in the afternoon, in the evening time, and you leave a pair out there, you get up in the morning and get them, they're soaking wet. Everything's wet, right? Because the dew comes in, it's always, but I think in the springtime, for whatever reason, it seems like the dew is heavier. It's not, but it feels like it is, right? Everything's wet, all right? You go out and walk around outside, I let the dog out, and I've got to make sure I put my boots on because the grass is soaking wet. If not, my feet are going to be wet, and it's going to be a whole ordeal, okay? So Gideon comes up with this plan and says, make the wool wet, but the ground dry. And he gets up the next day, and exactly as he has asked has taken place. Now, for me personally, walking out and looking around and seeing all of my grass dry and just this little piece of cloth or wool or whatever, that's the only thing that's wet. And it's so wet that I can wring it out and it makes a cup or a bowl full of water. To me, that says, ding, 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 this is exactly what I asked for. That should have been good enough. Okay? It wasn't. Now, we can complain about Gideon. We can point fingers at Gideon. But if we're in Gideon's situation, we probably want 3 or 4 tests, right? It's kind of how things go. But I think this would have been good enough. Should have been good enough, but it wasn't. Again, still showing Gideon's not fully trusting in God. Even after exactly what he wants to take place happens. And it's a totally miraculous event. There's no way in the world this should have worked, right? If I put a t-shirt outside, if I left the t-shirt outside last night that I was working with, this morning when I got up, everything was going to be wet because that's what happens. And this was not the case for Gideon. So exactly what he asked for took place. And it still wasn't good enough, right? He wants another test. Even though God does exactly what he wants, he's still unconvinced here. So he asked again. Verse 39, and Gideon said unto God, let not thine anger be hot against me. Gideon knows he shouldn't be asking for this. Right? That's when I was studying this is the one thing that popped out to me. Gideon knew full well that he shouldn't be asking for a second test. Right? He says, don't be mad. Right? Sometimes I go to Haley, honey, don't be upset, but I might have drug a little mud in by accident. I know you told me to take my shoes off. I thought they were okay. This is what Gideon's doing, right? God, don't be mad. I'm sorry, please, don't be mad. But I need you to do this, right? And he goes on, Lord, please, don't let thine anger be hot against me. I will speak but this once. Let me prove, I pray thee. But this once with the fleece. Let it now be dry. Only upon the fleece. and upon the rest of the ground let there be dew. Verse 40. And God did so that night, for it was dry upon the fleece only, and there was dew on all the ground. Just as a miraculous event took place the second day, right? Just as amazing as it was that just the fleece was wet, it's just equally as amazing that everything around it, right, all the way up to the point to where the fleece was laying on the ground, it was wet, right? But the fleece was dry. As a matter of fact, I bet, this is a Lanceism, I bet when Gideon picked the fleece up, the ground underneath the fleece was probably wet, but the fleece was dry. That's probably what happened, right? That's how amazing this was. And he gets his second test. God satisfies and is faithful in showing, giving Gideon what he wants. What way did Gideon's test reveal further his lack of respect for God? What did he's requiring these tests of God still shows what? What? A lack of faith, absolutely, right? He didn't show fully that God was trustworthy enough, right? He needed more. He needed more. He needed God to do something else. He needed God. All that showing is, I don't know if I can really trust you fully. Even after the first test happens, Gideon's still saying, I don't really know if I can fully trust you enough. He doesn't think God is powerful enough to defeat the Midianites. He realizes that God is powerful enough to keep a piece of wool dry and all the other ground wet, but he's not powerful enough. He can control the dew, but he's not powerful enough to destroy and defeat the Midianites like he said he would. He's powerful enough to make that meal that he created go up in flames with the touch of a staff, but not powerful enough to defeat the Midianites. That's what Gideon, essentially what Gideon is saying here. Gideon wants all of the unknowns completely eliminated. He's looking for a tangible guarantee he can hold in his hands, he can physically see and physically touch to help put his mind at ease. True faith is not bothered by unknowns or even incredibly unfavorable odds. True faith has God as its focus. In order to feel good about leading Israel to battle, Gideon needed to look to God rather than a burned-up offering or a piece of wool. God, of course, indulges Gideon's request, so Gideon might learn that faith doesn't come from God passing tests. Faith is simply believing that God is who he says that he is, and that he's going to do what he says he will do. This is a question, a rhetorical question. Don't answer it out loud. Answer it to yourself. When, if ever, have you held back on obeying God because you wanted a little more evidence and before it was okay to move forward? Let's finish this up. Go ahead, Chad. Gideon feared God's power and Gideon fears God's power and person here. As we see over into Judges chapter, go back one, sorry. And one more, should be all the way back. Yeah, keep it right there, perfect, thank you. So having shown Gideon that no tests would kind of bolster his faith in him, God puts Gideon in a situation where he could do nothing else but have faith in God. And we see that starting here in verse number 7. All right, go to verse number 1 here in chapter 7, and we see Gideon hearing, first of all, God's message. Then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well of Herod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. So Gideon now, we kind of flash to the beginning of the battle here. We're on the battlefield here. Gideon is about to engage the enemy, right? They're getting ready to have this battle here. 32,000 Israelites strong, so he has that many with him. Those have joined him beside the well of Herod. And as dawn breaks, in the light of the Israelites, they could peer across the sea, or the valley, peer across the valley, to a sea of well-armed, well-fortified, well-trained Midianites, and they are by the hill of Morah. That's where they are. So they could see this outnumbered them 4-to-1 army, better trained, better equipped, probably better looking all around, right, over there, and can see this task that is ahead of them. How could the Israelites possibly defeat a force that greatly outnumbers them? The task was just on the surface level, it's impossible, right? There's an impossibility to this. 4-to-1 odds are never good, especially when the other four are a lot better off, trained, and stronger than you are. But as we well know, this is going to get even more and more kind of impossible as this goes on. You know what? We have like 7 minutes. I don't want to fly through this. Let's just stop right here. We'll pick up with this battle next week. There's no way I'm going to get through 24 verses in 7 minutes unless I'm just flying, and I don't want to do that because this is a really cool story. So let's just stop right there for now. We'll get into the battle next. Of course, we know eventually God goes through this test, knocks the Israelite army down some, and then still knocks it down to eventually get to how many soldiers defeat the Midianites? 300, right? There are 300 soldiers here that take on an army of 100 and some thousand. And of course, the way it happens is really cool too. So we'll get into a little bit more of that next week. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you again for this story. Thank you for Gideon's life that we can look at, we can criticize, we can learn from, more importantly, about how lack of faith in you can be detrimental to us, first of all. But how also, when you probably could have very easily just kind of kicked Gideon to the side because of his fears and because of his unfaithfulness, how you were so faithful and patient with him and kind of built him and built his faith up to the point where he was able to lead this army against the Midianites and the great success that comes because of it as well, Lord. It's a twofold lesson for us of what unfaithfulness looks like, but also how faithful you can be to us and how patient and compassionate and loving you can be to us, even in the error of our ways, our missteps, our unfaithfulness, our disobedience, our fear, our uncertainty, our putting ourselves first. A lot of times, Lord, you still continue to teach us, still continue to allow us to learn and grow and be more faithful to you, Lord. And we're so thankful for that as well. We pray to finish up next week. You just continue, Lord, to teach us from this. I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes here the next little bit too, Lord, you'll keep us attentive to the word you have through him this morning. Keep us open ears, Lord, and open hearts to the lessons and truths you have for us. In your name I pray. Amen.